Hi, how's everybody doing this afternoon? Great. Show of hands, how many pastors do we have? Okay. How many pastors have built? How many pastors are hoping that the second coming comes before you have to build again? So. My name is Kurt Williams, and probably for almost 25 years now, I've worked with churches through the designing and building process. So really what I hope happens today is that we can brush over a lot of these issues, just things to look at in the future and to think about so that you don't become a statistic. And there's some statistics out there that I think all of us have recognized are unfortunate. For those of you guys that have built before, I'm not sure how real that comic looks. They say that the place that you can always design and build a facility the easiest is probably the first 2 or 3 building team meetings. And oftentimes it looks like it's just a little bit of assembly required, and all of a sudden what falls out of the box is this large thing with a lot of feedback. Is that me? That good? And I think sometimes when you hear about pastors in different churches saying, oh, I'll never build, I hope for the second coming before we ever get to that point, I think that a lot of that comes from some of these, again, this is meant to be funny, but it's not really. The 6 phases of a building project. You start off with a lot of enthusiasm. It soon leads to disillusionment. That turns into panic. That kind of grows into the search for the guilty, the punishment of the innocent, and praise and honor for anybody that had nothing to do with the actual act of designing and building the project. So there's a few heads. How many of those think that's kind of real? Sadly so. Okay, few hands, okay? What we're going to go over is just a list of things that I've learned over the years meeting with different pastors. There's 11 of them. Okay, so it's going to be kind of like drinking out of a fire hydrant. So I'm going to go a little bit quick, but any questions you have as we move through this, stop me and let's address them, because your memory is going to be better than mine if you can remember a question about tip 1 when we're on tip 10. The first tip is an easy to understand process to follow. Really, it doesn't matter if you're doing a $25,000 renovation or a $25 million relocation. People just want to know where they are in the process, and they want to know what the next step is. As pastors, you want to be able to communicate that to your people. The number one, I think the largest number one project in the world was probably the Tower of Babel. And how was that confused and thrown into chaos? Simple lack of communication. So try to find somebody that you work with that has a process that is easy to convey, it's graphic, and you can kind of follow the timeline as you move around to convey to your people where you are and what the different steps are. Now, as you look at process, and this happens to be one that we use, we're based out of Indianapolis, Indiana. We're not saying that our process is the best. As a matter of fact, our process is always changing and growing as we learn and we serve various churches. But we believe there's several key things that you need to make sure that you're touching on. Very early, what we call discovery would be feasibility. And a lot of times, one of those first steps, and a lot of these other tips we're going to touch on are basically more information on these various steps and stages, is a financial analysis and facility model. I don't know how many churches I've met with over the years that have the $5 million vision and maybe the $2 million ability to fund it. Well, let's just come to an agreement first that the target is going to be this $2 million. Now, there's master planning work and things like that will expand into this $5 million vision, but to draw all that up front and spend a lot of effort and energy on that, only to find out you can't afford it, it kind of defeats the purpose. Facility needs analysis. We're strong proponents of taking your ministry and wrapping a building around it. Not trying to take your ministry and shove it into somebody else's box. So work with an architect that is really focused on understanding who you are, what's your DNA, what's your mission, different things such as that. Site challenge analysis. One of the biggest derailers of projects. The bricks and sticks of buildings are fairly easy, but with today's site requirements and different things like that, the dirt tends to derail more projects than not, with some of your stormwater issues, your utility issues. I've worked with churches over the years that got this great 20-acre piece of ground and they got it virtually for free compared to the property in town. And then they found out after they added $1 million to it to get utilities and things like that, it became not the better deal. So do some early things on that. Other parts of a good process as you get into what we would call architecture is just getting into the design part of it. And that design isn't just the pretty picture. Let's look at things such as what's the acoustical issues. Acoustics are something that can always be resolved with money. You just spend less of it when it's on paper as opposed to walking into the space that's not performing well and trying to fix it. Work through your mechanical, your electrical, your plumbing systems, a lot of things like that. Bring them in very early so that you can figure that out on paper again instead of out in the field. Site planning, major issue. I'm sure you guys have seen churches in the middle of that beautiful piece of property. On 3 sides of the church are parking lots. On the back side of the church is all the major utilities and infrastructure. So when you go to expand, which piece or part of that have you already paid for? Are you going to rip out to redo? So master plan so that you're not making those kind of mistakes. We operate through an open book bidding process. So we usually encourage churches to get involved with looking at the subcontractors and different people to be bidding on your project. Getting into construction, again, just a process that you can share with your people. At what point will all the final plans be completed? At what point will we have state and local permits? What point will we go through different bidding checks? And then as you get into the construction part, quality control, different things like that. So again, the process that's up on the screen right now is the one that we use. I'm sure other great firms out there are using similar type processes just to make sure that all the bases are covered and you can convey to your people where you are as you move through that. So the first tip, an easy to understand process to follow. The second tip that almost unanimously is kind of neck and neck between process and the health of the church. Tom Rainer's written a number of different books on health, and one of his quotes is, "I would not consider a building program without first conducting a church health assessment." There's a lot of different tools out there that can help that. I was fortunate enough to go through some training with Mr. Rainer a number of years ago, and one of the unfortunate statistics out there, and this is up from 18 months, it is now 22 months that a pastor will survive after a major building project. So congratulations, you've gained 4 months of life. For those of you that aren't pastors and you're wanting to get a new pastor, I would encourage a building project. That's the best way to get them to move along. But that's an unfortunate, it's not really funny. But I had the opportunity to ask him that I don't really think that it's the pastor is the issue with getting run out in 18 to 22 months. It's the fact that there's a lot of money involved with church projects, and this was just the catalyst. This was the opportunity for somebody to start throwing rocks at the pastor that dealt with totally unrelated issues, but the construction was what brought it to the surface. I was told it was an interesting concept, but statistically very difficult to prove. So the health of the church is a very key issue. When you look at some of the statistics of church health, 83% of churches are in decline right now. The 17% that are growing, only 4 of them are growing through new conversion. Senior pastors are only lasting 3.4 years at each pastorate just in general. So the earlier statistic was 22 months after a major building project, 3.4 years just overall. And then when you look at the population trends of the country, we're growing by 8% in population. Church attendance is declining by 8%. Building projects are stressful. Make sure you're healthy. Kind of walking into a building project thinking that it will help the situation is kind of like building a house to enhance your marriage relationship. So make sure you're healthy before you step into a project like this, because it is stressful. Even with a great process and a great design build team that you may work with, there's going to be stressful points as you move through that. A vision and a mission. I tend to be a Tom Rainer fan. He wrote a great book, Simple Church, and Ray Bowman wrote another great book, When Not to Build. I'd suggest both of them before you go into a project. But if a church can't build a paragraph around their vision and mission, don't try to build a building around it. And I had the opportunity, I met with a church and I was looking at their vision and mission, and it looked awful similar to my own church's, and almost so similar as verbatim. And I said, this looks kind of familiar. I think I've seen this before. And he said, oh yeah, there's this big church on the other side of the river, and I thought it was great. It wasn't his. There's a lot of churches, I think, that you'd be surprised how many that don't have a vision or mission statement, as much as that's kind of mantraed, but there's a lot that don't. Some that do just thought that somebody else's was neat, and we'll bring that in and adopt it and use that. It needs to be yours. You'd be surprised how much the design team will want to understand who you are, your DNA from that, and make a lot of their design decisions on that information that we had from the very beginning. Vision and mission, that again, each one of these tips is a whole hour-long discussion. But when you look at that, I look at 4 key things that a lot of times it will address or help your design team work through. Purpose. What is the core purpose of your church? Who are you trying to reach? Program. Which ministries are growing and why are they growing? I think that's a great question, is why are you growing? I mean, we always hear this ministry, the youth ministry, is going crazy. Why? I always heard after they answer that, then ask why again, then ask why a third time. You get down to the root of what's really driving that. And then the property. With the vision you have, if you may have a vision that requires 50 acres of property and you're maxed out at 20 no matter what. That doesn't mean that vision isn't relevant. It means it just might change. Maybe you're looking at more of a multi-site type situation. But get the vision and mission nailed down early, and you'd be surprised how much that will assist you through the design and build process. The finance process is tip number 4. And a great friend of mine that's in the banking industry, he always kind of jokes, money's not everything, but it is kind of like oxygen. And we're not going to get real far without finances to fund it. And there's really just simple things that you can dig into to find out what you can afford as you work with different banking and financial professionals, just to how much you can afford to build. And that's how much have you saved already, how much can you raise, and then how much can you borrow? And I know in this economy, borrowing is not the best thing in the world, but unfortunately, that's something that we tend to face a lot of. George Barna has thrown out a number of statistics over the years, and I thought this was interesting. I thought I'd share. Over 90% of givers say they do so because they are convinced that the church believes and stands for the same thing that they do. Over 80% will give because they believe the ministry is impacting lives, and over 60% will give towards an urgent need for the ministry. So when you look at all of this and pulling it together and how you cast out that vision and how you share the communication part of it is how you get people, excited and wanting to give towards your project. There's a lot of times where, and again, I guess I've learned over the years that you ask very early, where are you working through the financial process? Because I've heard of a lot of churches, they've got plans, they're ready to go, and now we're going to start talking to banks. Now, they do need certain amounts of information as you move through the process that helps you through the appraisal and what they will loan and different things like that. But what I always tell groups is you want to start talking about your financial situation, working with different institutions as soon as possible. I think that's one of the earliest things that you do. If you looked at the process that we use, one of the first steps that we go through is a financial analysis. There's really no sense in going down a design path, designing something that can very well cost much more than what you can possibly pull together financially. So find out very early what is the possible, and that'll give your design and build team a great target to shoot at and not shoot over the target. Who should help? We're going to talk about building committees here in a little bit, but a member of your team should be financially savvy, be in the industry, in the market. There's a lot of language that he can speak the same with financial people. That if you don't have an individual like that, you're kind of floundering around trying to understand all these different options. I know as I've worked with different churches, they'll talk to 3 different banks and get 3 totally different answers or proposals, and they're literally apples and oranges and grapefruit. So if you've got somebody amongst you that understands the process, can speak that same language, that's going to get you in a great position from the get-go. Who else should help? I really think that it should be the obligation of the design and the build firm that you're working with to be asking some of these questions early. Again, I never want to be in the position where we've been working and we've developed this beautiful $5 million project, and I really just failed to ask the question early and find out that only $2 million was actually possible. Trying to back up something like that is not a very fun announcement from the pulpit. This beautiful picture we've shown you, we just can't afford, when if you knew from day one what the target was, that would never be an announcement from the pulpit there. Any questions as we've gone through so far with the finance process or any of the other tips there? I'm either doing a great job or I'm totally not doing it well. Take a pick. The fifth one, building committee structures. Obviously, the committee of from a design and a build perspective, the committee of one is great. There's some inherent problems with that. The committee of 3 to 5 is really gives your design and build team a great feel for who you guys are and to be able to gather that information. Some of this seems pretty basic. The first one that's listed there is fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ. A lot of times your building chairman may not fit that particular bill. It may be because he's the largest donor. There's a lot of different issues there. But it's interesting. Almost every pastor I talk with, one of the first things when I was trying to gather what's important to you for your building committee, the first thing that came out was a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ, which tells me that they've experienced other issues where they weren't. Full support of the ministry and the vision and the mission of the ministry. Emotional stability, respected by the body, by the people in your congregation. Common sense. I didn't really make these up. This is what I was told. Diligent and committed to the process. And I think there's an emphasis on process. One of my old jokes is that you could talk on Monday, we could draw on Tuesday, and we'll be out on the site digging on Wednesday. It doesn't happen that fast. So it's a process, and they need to be dedicated to it. I usually share with people that sometimes the pre-construction part of that can be upwards of a year. I've worked with churches 2 years in the preliminary process. Now that's not a meeting every week, but it's sometimes at least one meeting a month, if not two, based at different points that we are in the complexity or the emphasis of that, where we are in that timeline. But it's a process, and they need to be committed to it. Creative planning. I always tell people that the solution isn't with your architect, and the solution isn't with your builder, and you don't really have the solution either. The solution is about right here in the middle of the table. So to be working with creative people all the way around really makes for a great solution for you guys. So have some creative people that can help be part of that. It's interesting. The first thing we had was a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ, which is kind of a weird one. The last one that you may think is equally weird is construction knowledge. That's not necessarily the requirement to be on the building team. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the guy that just added a sunroom to his house last year and is now a full-fledged general contractor, he can be sometimes the hardest one to work with through the process, because your facility, this church facility, is a commercial structure. It has a lot different, stricter regulations and codes and things we have to do than what his home did. So the construction knowledge, if you've got a good group you're working with, that should be the least of the requirements there. What we're really looking for is just committed people, love the Lord, committed to the process, and are creative because they're trying to find a solution for you and your ministry. Jack Coffey, for years, I just found out here a little bit ago that he's no longer heading up Southeast Christian's construction efforts, but for years, I think he built was in charge of building about 90% of their campus. And this was some feedback that he gave us. at the NACDB, which is the National Association of Church Design Builders. And a lot of this fits with what the information I got from pastors as well, is keep the committee small, 3 to 5 people, include communicators. I remember at different times he would share that it's your committee's job to sell this project to the congregation. So make sure that they're good communicators. Now he's pretty adamant about keeping the senior pastor off the committee. I would probably disagree with him a little bit. I do think the senior pastor should be an arm's length away, but it's his vision of where the church is going. And this building committee, I think, obviously we shared earlier, touched on earlier, that they need to be bought into that vision and mission, but to have him totally absent, I think could produce a solution that's not as good as if he was there participating. But Jack does touch on have staff people there that can speak to that and help you, the church from a staff position move through it. Choose people who will work well together. I've worked with a couple committees where they knowingly had people that did not get along because they were trying to win one over to this side or that side. That's tough. And then just remain focused on the mission of the church as you move through. There's complete books that have been written on building committee structures and how to do that. So we could talk all day on that. Are there any questions about building committees there? Okay. Understand the delivery system. And again, this is a whole probably 3-hour discussion on this. But it's really just understanding what is the delivery you're going to get and what are the pros and cons. Every delivery system has a pro and con. One that's more traditional is the design, bid, build delivery. You hire the architect, you do the drawings, you put the drawings out to bid to 2, 3, 4, 5 different general contractors. Okay. There's inherent pros to it, i.e. the architect is fulfilling the role of ensuring that the project or the contractor is building the project the way that it was drawn to the proper quality standards, and that we're adhering schedule, approving different things like that. Okay. One of the inherent negatives is as you work through it, it's very difficult for the architect to get truly accurate costs as you're working through the process. Okay, so there tends to be an event that happens on the bid opening where you had the $5 million project and the bids open up at 5.5 or 6 million. I think the last statistic I saw is that the projects average 15% over budget at the initial bid opening, and then they have to back up and do some redesign there, and that was through the American Institute of Architects, if I recall correctly. So anyway, some pros and cons with that. Now obviously another pro is you're getting competitive bids from a couple different general contractors and you're moving through that. Construction is still the second most litigated industry to medical, okay? Of the different delivery systems, the one that's the most litigated, unfortunately, is this approach, because you've got a set of plans, the contractors have bid it, every time there's a discrepancy, not if. I always tell people that it's not if you're going to have a problem on your project, it's when you have a problem on your project, and that's where you get into selecting who your contractors are and what are their track records dealing with those issues. But in this kind of environment, oftentimes, that's where a lot of the arguing tends to take place. So of a percentage, the bulk of that, of litigation and construction, tends to revolve around this particular delivery system. Other delivery system is a construction management approach. We don't really see that with 90% of the churches that we've been involved with. And it solely revolves around the fact that the church holds all of the various agreements. They're holding all the contractors, all the subcontractors, all the vendors, and the suppliers. And then they hire a construction manager to help them work through that process. It's a very transparent system because every different line item is being bid and quoted, and you get to see that. Again, the negatives, you're hanging on to all these different agreements, and most churches just don't have the staff to try to manage that. Design build has really been a process that churches have selected to eliminate that. The designer and the builder are together. A lot of times the builder, the way we operate is the builder partners with an independent architect. Integrated project delivery is probably the latest word that's being used a lot, where you're bringing in an independent design professional, an independent contractor from day one, and they're working in your best interest all the way through the course of it, helping you control the costs. You're understanding what the costs are, and it's very similar to construction management from the aspect of everything is bid and quoted in an open book format. I tend to think that an integrated project delivery, design build is the best for churches because you get to see everything, but then you're protected from some of the inherent risks of construction if there's a discrepancy in the plans or something like that. So it's just the design build firms kind of bag to hold if there's any issues there. Tip number 7 was managing expectations, and every pastor I talked with said that the expectations of the congregation was always in excess of the reality that that was coming up towards them. In really 3 kind of key areas: the costs of it. That's where a lot of times a firm that can work through the facility modeling or different things like that to help you understand that the church that they think can be built for $40 a square foot when the national average is $100 and $105 a square foot isn't really feasible. But people think back to wherever their last frame of reference was. A flip side, we've worked with different groups where one of the key people on the board was on the school board. Well, they're used to spending money at a different level. I mean, maybe not always theirs, it's ours. And what they were anticipating was $150 to $175 square foot, just because they were coming from a school perspective. So to just understand what is the expectation and then correct it if it needs to very, very early in that process. Site is another big one. We touched on that earlier, where by bringing in some engineers or somebody very early to evaluate your site, especially if it's a green site, is very important. A lot of times people don't realize, matter of fact, we've got 2 projects right now where we're running forced main sewers over a half mile on each of them. And each project, one has 7 easements, the other one has 10 private easements that we have to pick up. It just takes one of those easements not to happen, and the project is basically doomed. So just different things like that to find out what you're up against before you bite off that property. The type of space needed. Before you even start, I think that's where a lot of the vision, the mission, where you found out earlier what ministries are growing and why they're growing. We love to talk to passionate people about different areas of the church as we're going through the programming process. If we listen to the youth guy, how many of you guys are youth pastors or real involved with your youth? Okay, very little. Well, I can talk to you and you guys can all agree with me maybe. If we just listen to them, every facility we build would be 3 courts of basketball and climbing walls and maybe something to do with rappelling and maybe even parachuting or something like that. We want passionate people. We want to get that information from them, but from a vision aspect, maybe that's just not where you're going. So just get that clear before you get into it, and then really the ability to fund it. A lot of people think, oh, I've banked with that, with XYZ Bank for 20 years. They'll give us a loan. Start early, figure out what you can afford to do, and just get all those expectations in line. The number 8 tip was just wise stewardship decisions. And the National Association of Church Facilities Managers, NACFM, this is a statistic they provided. There's always 3 key areas that as a design and build approach that there's always a struggle on. If you look at the top of that triangle, we call it ministry, and that's the square footage that you think you need for this project. The bottom hand right corner is the materials that you might use for it. The bottom left-hand corner is the money side of it. There's always this tension between the 3. Okay, what happens a lot of times is a group will say, we need 20,000 square feet of space, and we have, the ability to fund $50 a square foot of construction. Okay, we've already kind of shared that's unrealistic. Can that happen? It can. That's where, we've heard the term here recently, the worship warehouse. Okay, they build warehouses in that $50 square foot range. Okay, so what just happened there is you had square footage that you didn't want to give up, yet obviously a limited amount of money. So what gives? What gives is the type of materials that you might use. You're taking a lesser cost approach on your material. Well, that's fine and good today. Now you look at the NACFM's numbers in a 40-year time period after you build, where did all of your money go? And it's just fascinating. 75% of it went to the maintenance and the upkeep and the repair of your building. Okay, a lot of that can be tied back to inferior or lesser quality materials you might have used. There's a few heads nodding. 14.5% went to your finance costs. Only 10% of the costs in 40 years went to the actual act of building the building and the construction costs. And a plug for contractors out there, only 0.5% was actually the contractor fees to get it built. So when you look at this, and I'm not saying, obviously you've got ministry growth, and you don't want to constrain it, and you never, but you unfortunately have to let the dollars kind of hold you back a little bit. And you might be okay for your generation. Today, I actually had one group say, I'll be 6 foot under before I have to worry about these issues. True, but is that really a long-term stewardship? That means his kids are picking up the tab later. So I just think it's something worthy of looking at and considering, that you may be able to get square footage cheap today, but what will it really cost you tomorrow as you look at that? Every church is different. Every church has different financial constraints. What I hope is this information maybe steer you a little bit different way. At least you're making your decision in a wise way. Part of wise stewardship choices, and I think this is where if you're working with a group that has a process and it's very engaged with you very early working through it, is stewardship choices don't have to happen after you open up the bids. There's a term in the construction industry called value engineering. That's also can be construed as code for let's make the building cheaper when we're in trouble. And that usually happens after you've worked through a process, and you have a bid opening, and you've got this $5 million target, and it's $5.5 million. Okay. Now the firm is going to value engineer that $500,000 to get you guys back into budget. Okay. That's where a lot of things tend to change. Lighter gauge of materials, lesser mills of coatings, different things like that. That does save you money, but is it really a value added decision, or is it something that becomes that 40-year statistic later on where you spend a lot of money because of that? We're firm believers, and if you look at this this graph here, the bottom left-hand corner, and as that moves upwards to the right, that is the amount of money that you are spending through a process of making decisions and designing and discussing materials and options you might have. The upper left-hand corner, as it slopes down to the right, that is the amount of influence that you can apply to the situation. Okay, so it's pretty interesting. When you're spending the least amount of money, you have the most amount of influence. Does that make sense? Okay. So what that means, or what that should mean, is very early in the process, be working through all these decisions. When you have your bid opening, which is where those two lines collide, you should be at $5 million or under if that's your target. You shouldn't have a $5.5 million project on your hands. And decisions that you made that helped keep you in line to keep under that budget were made very early. You're not revising 100 pages of plans to get back into budget. You're tweaking 1 or 2 pages and making decisions about your specifications very early, and you know what you're getting. You're part of that. There's life cycles. You know that if I pick this, yes, it's not as good as what we originally had hoped for. It'll give you 7 years of life. I'm grabbing this out of the air. What we had before was a 15-year thing that had life. Okay, do you want to do that or not? You're part of that. You're participating in the decisions about your building and the lifespan of your building. So just a thing, work with a group is very transparent and is involving you in that process so that you're making wise stewardship choices for yourself, not for the firm that may be designing or building your facility. Property issues. This has come up several times earlier in my talk, and it's tip number 9. Just make yourself aware of them. Again, how many churches I've dealt with that bought this great piece of ground, lost some people in the process of the transition because they were going to the ground, only to find out that it's going to cost them 3 times the amount of money to develop that property as opposed to the property that was right on the city limits or something like that. And there's just a lot of things, and some of this is pretty universal. It's not just an Indiana type of thing, but just your parking requirements. You know, a common code that's out there is every 4 seats in your worship space equals 1 parking space in your parking lot. Okay. We believe that the family of 4 finds a way to bring 5 vehicles to service on Sunday. Okay, so we tend to want to share or throw out the ratio of a 2-to-1 ratio, so that way you're not chasing away different visitors that might come there. So sometimes when you look at your property issues, you want to look at the code or the requirement, but then you want to back up a little bit and say, but what's good for us? Parking is one of the rare ones where actually the code is much less than what it should be. Green space requirements. Now obviously some of this depends on if you're urban or rural, how you get into it. The egress and ingress, how do you get in and out of the property onto the road system? You know, a county road versus a highway is probably, there's probably about 5 or 6, at least 5 zeros that are attached in the price between those 2 alternatives. If you know where it is, at least you're planning for it up front. You're not getting surprised with $200,000 worth of acceleration, deceleration, and passing blisters out on the roadway. The topography of your property, which is the terrain. A lot of times people look at a perfectly flat piece of ground and say, oh, that's wonderful. That's actually harder to develop than something that has a little bit of roll to it. Wetlands, you know, I've had a few people ask, you know, we've got cattails in a couple different places on our property. Can we just like mow those or plow them over? And it's like, no, you can't really do that. So you start looking at property, especially through the early stages of trying to buy it, is have an engineer look at it, because sometimes you can have just a small section of these, what you think is the wetlands, that's actually much, much larger. And once you buy it, it's yours. So just look at that, make sure you know what that is. Stormwater retention. There's a lot of water quality issues that starts to eat up a lot of your property. You have to store your rainwater. You have to clean it before it gets into the public systems. There's just different things like that that just starts eating up all of your properties. You go through that. Right-of-way expansion, setbacks. I always tell people, just get a great design and build team that can help you look at all these different things. And they tend to vary. I mean, obviously they vary from state to state, but they also vary from locale to locale, and also based on the infrastructure you currently have. Sometimes you can't even you may have public sewer on your property, but due to moratorium, you're not allowed to tap it for the next 5 years. So just different things like that. If you get a good engineering firm to help you work through that, you'll at least know what you're securing and how to work with that. Tip number 10, understanding building codes and plans. And the last bullet I had here was get a great design and build team, and you should. You're really paying a team of professionals to understand the building codes and the plans. But to have some base knowledge or have some on your team that can digest that information. There's a lot of things that affect the cost of a building. I think that's where we find some of that disparity between somebody that just built their home for $50 or $60 a square foot, and they just can't fathom why their church, which is larger, more open, costs $100 a square foot. A lot of it's just the different codes you have to get. You have to make allowance for in the design. And some of them too, you know, the more rural the church we get into, sometimes you get in areas where some of the permitting may be somewhat lax. So they do things that maybe don't meet the code, and maybe even the architect has told them this doesn't meet the code, but they're saying, well, it's okay, we're a country church and we're fine, we can do this. And then what happens is a state inspector makes his rounds every now and then. At least in Indiana, we have a state inspector. And all of a sudden, he flags this. And now you've got a finished building that should have fire sprinklers that does not have fire sprinklers. That's a tough nut to crack, to come back into a facility and retrofit something to that magnitude. If you at least have a base knowledge, or have somebody on your team that has a base knowledge of the codes and knows how to read a set of plans, different things like that, that's just miles in advance. One of the other things that we looked at is, how many of you pastors out there can read a set of plans and understand what they're saying to you? I got one kind of like this, two kind of like this. Okay. Most pastors can't. And if you can, I wouldn't tell your congregation, because they'll make you build it next then too. But the thing is there's a lot of lines on it. There's a lot of little arrows. There's lots of numbers and different things on that. A good design and build team will walk through the plans with you to make sure that everything that they've understood is drawn, it's represented, it's been priced. And I can usually look over at the pastor if he's there and he's just kind of glazing over, okay? Because that's not really your gifting, to get into that kind of minutia. So to have somebody that is good at that, understands, can speak the language. Usually as we move through the preliminary part of the process, we've got a large team of people, some that 3 to 5, sometimes 10. As we get to the final stages on the plans, we're usually down to that one guy that has a lot of construction experience, and maybe one or two other people with him, but make sure they're there. And really that pretty much rounds out the building plans. Again, find a good team, a design and a build team that you trust, and work through that, and they'll help you, and they'll learn and they'll teach you to read plans and understand them a little bit better. The last tip, which is my favorite, is kicking the people out of the building. Several pastors mentioned that it's so tough. They're working through. People are ready to use the building, and what it becomes is the final destination, and everybody wants to just fall back and relax and take a deep breath. And they all said that that deep breath, that relaxation, is a very important thing. It's a time of celebration. We're through this. Let's use the building. Let's have fun with it. And sometimes I lose track that this is just a tool to reach out to the community and bring them in. And if you're not kicking your people out and bringing the community in, you've really failed on this project. They felt that the best way to do that was just continually, all the way through the process, invite people. A lot of times through the course of construction, we'll have several different points in time where we can get the actual job site at a safe level, where they'll have a community event and try to bring the people in, get them excited. Instead of just driving by the road and saying, "Oh, it's that church over there they're building," bring them in and walk them through. And this is this area or that area, and just get the people more involved in there. But also get your own people in that mode, if they're not already, of reaching out to others and bringing them into the church. But that was the funnest one, and it makes the most sense. Just make sure you're kicking your people out and making use of a great tool that took some time to develop. That is really the close of this. I understand there may be more questions from online, or maybe there's some additional questions here. Yes, sir.
What are the general cost differences between the design build and the design bid build?
Okay. The question was, what are the general cost differences between design build or design bid build? And you could probably look at different stories all around the country, and you're going to see a mishmash of different answers there. They both have their pros and cons on how they get their numbers. Obviously, as members of the National Association of Church Design Builders, I have a bent or a bias to the design build side. And that really comes from the fact that It's not if you're going to have a construction problem or a design problem, it's when. And in a design build arrangement, the only place you can point the finger is back at your design builder. Now, there's certain things the design builder can do to make it more transparent for you. And I'm very much a strong proponent of believing that all the numbers should be open. It should be competitive bidding on all the line items. The firm's overhead and profit and general conditions should be open, and you guys should be able to see all of that. So I tend to believe that would be the easier, the less risk solution for the church. Some design build is given in a closed book, a lump sum type of thing. That's a little bit harder because now you've got the architect and the contractor in the same boat. But if it's open, transparent, independent architectural firm, I think that's a better solution. And what you're protecting yourself from, I think at the end of the day, the dollars and cents in the bidding format will be very similar between the two deliveries. What you're protecting yourself from is the downstream issues that might arise in a design build arrangement. You've just paid them to bear that brunt of those oversights, because that's what it really is. It's oversight on your design build team's fault, not oversight on just the architect with the contractor pointing his finger at the guy. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Would the process be very similar, the same, if you're just doing a retrofit of an existing building?
Okay, good question. The question was, would the process be the same if you're doing a retrofit as opposed to an addition, a relocation, something like that? And I tend to believe that it should be. My opening statement was, if it's a $25,000 retrofit or a $25 million relocation, there's just certain things that I think should be addressed as you move through it. So I don't think necessarily the size of the project would change my answer on that. Again, you know your congregation better than I do. Sometimes they get so small. Our own church, my own church has done projects I didn't even know took place because that happened on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And, so do you need to involve a lot of people in something like that? No, probably not. It's a good question, though. Other questions? Okay. Well, appreciate your time. If you've got any questions, I'll still be around here that you want to ask more one-on-one as opposed to an audience. And it's been a blast. Enjoy the conference. It looks like a great event. Thank you.